In the now 30 years since Magic the Gathering first premiered, many Magic the Gathering players have enjoyed fun, creative, clever, and all-around evocative card designs. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it isn't many Magic the Gathering players so much as all of us. And all of us certainly have a specific card that first made us fall in love with this wonderful, nuanced game. There's nothing quite like playing with a well-designed card and seeing it face off against your opponent's equally well-designed cards in new and exciting ways, game after game after game. Many of our beloved cards are so beloved because of a mechanic that Wizards of the Coast knocked out of the park. Prowess, landfall, flashback. These are keywords so iconic that Wizards of the Coast has returned to them time and time again. And yet, sometimes Wizards of the Coast does not return to their iconic keywords regardless of their status as undeniable fan favorites. Maybe they show up in the occasional supplemental product, but despite first premiering a decade ago or longer, still have yet to return to standard, which is a shame because these mechanics are fantastic, simply fantastic, which is why I have compiled a list of the top 5 keywords that are at least 10 years old and, despite being exceptional, have never returned to standard. We may have seen some of these pop up in supplemental sets, but they've never been revisited in a main set, and it's time that Wizards of the Coast reprinted these keywords, you cowards. Because we love them! So buckle up, because some of these keywords are so iconic, so beloved, that it may just surprise you to learn that they've never come back. Let's jump right in, shall we? But first, did you know in Magic's early years it was intended to be played between RPG sessions? A lot has changed since 1993, of course, including tournaments, conventions, and the rise of Commander. These days, you might as well want an RPG to play in between sessions of Magic. And if so, have I got just the game for you. It's the sponsor of today's video, Dungeon Hunter 6, a mobile action RPG that features fast-paced hack-and-slash combat with a suite of classes and skills to utilize as you take on powerful bosses. You can choose between PvE and PvP, battle in real-time guild wars, grind skill trees, trade items, and more. It's also absolutely free to play. Download it now using the link in this video's description, or just scan the QR code on screen if you're viewing on a PC or Mac. It works if you scan the QR code. It's just that, like, if you're viewing this on it, you can just scan the QR code. Just scan it. It's technology. One of Dungeon Hunter's most interesting new features is the way it plays with boss battles. After you've defeated a boss, you can shapeshift into them, summon up to 3 to aid you in combat, follow you, perform combos, or use them as a mount to ride. And you know what? This newest iteration in the franchise doesn't scrimp on technical upgrades either. The game takes its 3D graphics performance to the next level with exquisite skill animations that are optimized for multicasting. Goat Games has taken great pains to ensure the best visual experience and smoothest combat on mobile devices. So if you're ready for an RPG adventure you can carry in your pocket, download Dungeon Hunter 6 on iOS Android today. Use my link in this video's description or just scan this QR code to get a special starter pack and use your game account to enter the launch Lucky Spin event to win great prizes like an iPhone 15 Pro Max, a PS5, Apple Watch, and even more starting October 15th. Thanks again for sponsoring this video. Before we begin the list, we have an honorable mention. One of the most brilliant mechanics in all of Magic the Gathering's history that absolutely needs to come back. I know you're already shouting it at the screen. It's banding. Banding is a keyword first introduced in Alpha that... Just kidding. Can you imagine if banding was actually on this list? Banding belongs on no list. It deserves its own video. No, the actual honorable mention for this list is hellbent, an ability keyword from Dissension, the final set in the original Ravnica block. The ability was associated with the Rakdos Guild, and it made your cards stronger when you had no cards in hand. Hellbent technically doesn't qualify for the list because the keyword was featured on 4 cards in Future Sight, a set that came out about a year after Dissension. But the mechanic hasn't returned to standard since then, which was over 16 years ago. It's been over 16 years since we've seen a new Hellbent card in standard. The other reason hellbent didn't make the proper list is because it was actually pretty unpopular among Magic players when it was first introduced. You see, Magic the Gathering players generally prefer to have cards in their hand rather than not having cards in their hand, so cards that ask you to be empty-handed aren't ones that players tend to be drawn towards. But despite that, there's still a lot to like about the mechanic. There's something flavorful and exciting about a card being the last one you cast, and there's a scrappy feel to having a board full of hellbent creatures while you are empty-handed. There's also a wide range of design space for hellbent. As long as the card is decent enough to cast with cards in hand, having hellbent is all upside. Something like a divination that draws you an extra card if you are empty-handed, for instance, or a creature that's good in the early turns, but gets even better in the late game. The biggest hurdle to designing more hellbent cards is that it's hard to imagine printing hellbent on a card that isn't in Rakdos colors for flavor reasons. Hellbent Azurius? Hellbent Simic? It's a keyword that just feels so restricted to red-black. But that doesn't mean the mechanic isn't worth revisiting in a set with a strong red-black theme. Mark Rosewater has said that he does expect hellbent to return eventually, it's just a matter of when and where. Moving on to our proper list, number 5 is extort, an ability keyword that premiered in the Return to Ravnica block as the mechanic associated with the Orzhov Guild. The ability goes on permanents of any type. Whenever you cast a spell while an extort permanent is in play, you may pay a single white or black mana. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain life equal to the amount of life lost. The ability was originally printed on 11 permanents in Orzhov colors in Gatecrash, then in 2 more in Dragon's Maze. Since then, we've seen only 1 new extort card, Life Insurance from the Streets of New Capenna Commander decks. If you play a lot of Commander, you've probably encountered extort a lot, as it holds a place on 2 very iconic Orzhovian cards, Blind Obedience and Crypt Ghast. Both these cards have a useful effect outside of their extort ability, but the extort provides you with a subtle, yet significant boost in a multiplayer format. Each opponent only loses the 1 life, but you gain a life for every opponent who lost a life. In most cases, that's a whopping 3 life gained for every spell you extort. Since it's scaled well to multiplayer formats, the best extort cards for Commander have withstood the test of time. Extort was very popular when it premiered. It was a very fun and powerful limited mechanic, providing longevity and a natural payoff for that longevity in the form of the mana sink it offers you. The mechanic was strong enough that it could hold its own on a creature with no other abilities and still turn that creature into a reasonable limited card. But in constructed formats, extort just isn't enough on its own to warrant play. It didn't see a ton of play in its standard format outside of a couple copies of Blind Obedience and Slow Control decks. Blind Obedience is a back-breaking card versus decks reliant on haste creatures, turning these hasty monsters into fish in a barrel to sweep up with the Wrath of God. The extort mechanic was a nice bonus that pushed Blind Obedience into the range of playability. Given recent card design trends, if extort returned to standard, I would not be surprised to see extort printed on several cards that were solid permanents on their own, which would lead to a lot more extort triggers occurring in standard. Perhaps a cheap enchantment that gives all your other permanents extort, or a mana rock of some kind that has extort. Heck, the mechanic could even work in a 3-color set, with the mechanic appearing on a 3rd non-white, non-black card. You know, I'm quite the massive morbid head myself, and thus I am crossing all of my fingers, toes, and vital organs that this highly evocative mechanic comes back from the dead in Duskmourn, House of Horror. Morbid is an ability keyword from the absolute banger of a block known as Innistrad. No, not Shadows over Innistrad, not Innistrad Crimson Vow. Nothing more scary than having to get married, am I right, fellas? I speak, of course, of the original Innistrad block, the first, the best. And Morbid was an ability keyword from there that really stood out. Cards that have Morbid get better whenever a creature dies, such as Reaper of the Abyss, a 6/6 flying for 6, where at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you get to destroy target non-demon creature. The keyword was originally printed on Golgari cards with one exception, Brimstone Volley, a limited all-star that saw a little bit of standard play by red deck wins lunatics such as myself who would sacrifice their goblin arsonist to Goblin Grenade and then cast Brimstone Volley for 5. Oh, those were the days. Morbid is one of the coolest mechanics in Magic, both from a flavor and a gameplay perspective. Flavor-wise, the idea of a card getting stronger when a creature dies is exactly in line with what a gothic horror plane like Innistrad is all about. From a gameplay perspective, it's great with removal spells, of course, but it's also a cool way to break parity on a clogged board state where both players have a lot of creatures in play. Generally in these spots, combat math is a tricky calculation because it can be difficult to tell which player benefits the most if certain creatures trade. But if you have Morbid cards in your deck or on the battlefield, you come out ahead anytime one of your creatures trades with an opponent's creature. Morbid also offers some sweet synergies with Aristocrat strategies, since the creature that died need not be an opponent's creature. Mark Rosewater has said that the design space for Morbid is a bit more limited than you might expect. Generally, the phase of a turn where Morbid is most often turned on is the second main phase, which means it's hard to put Morbid on combat tricks and other instants. There's also some flavor restrictions to Morbid. You can only reasonably include it in a set where death and dying are major themes, and only on cards that somehow relate to those themes. The most natural colors for cards having to do with death are black and green, so it's no wonder that the mechanic was originally limited to Golgari cards, except for Brimstone Volley. There have been several opportunities for Wizards of the Coast to bring back Morbid, from our now multiple returns to Innistrad to our recent return to New Phyrexia. All very scary, on-theme planes where death could certainly have played a mechanical role in the set's design. But as of yet, Morbid has never returned to Standard. But with the horror set of Duskmourn on the horizon, maybe we won't have to wait too long for Morbid to return. Coming in at number 3, we once again return to the Ravnica block, and specifically the Return to Ravnica block, for the Is It mechanic of Overload. Wait, don't groan yet! Overload is the key component to the infamous sweeper that every Commander player loves to hate. But don't blame all of Overload on the sins of Cyclonic Rift. Plenty of Overload cards are awesome. Rise and Shine, Scale Up, Winds of Abandon, Mizzix's Mastery, damn! No, I mean damn, the card damn. But also damn, Overload is such a fun combination of strong and cool. Though unfortunately the only place Wizards seems to use Overload anymore is in supplemental products because it hasn't once been brought back to Standard, and thus the mechanic's inclusion on this list. But let's take it from the top. If you have never been Cyclonic Rifted at instant speed, oh you sweet summer child. Overload is a mechanic that goes on instants and sorceries with targeted abilities. If you cast a card for its normal mana cost, that is the cost in the upper right corner, it has the single target effect printed in its text box. But if you cast it for its Overload cost, each instance of the word target is replaced with the word each. What does that mean in practice? Well, if you spend 6 mana to cast Winds of Abandon instead of just 2, all your opponent's creatures go bye-bye. This mechanic is a ton of fun. You know, one of the fundamental truths about Magic the Gathering is that casting massive spells is an absolute blast. But a second, much more unfortunate fundamental truth is that putting big spells in your deck is a risky proposition because you only get to cast so many big spells in a game, and you're highly liable to get run over by an aggro deck before you even get a chance to cast one. Overload smiles at the first of these fundamental truths while paying due diligence to the second. By giving you a cheaper, smaller version of the spell you really want to cast, you can better justify putting the big spell in your deck, because you have access to that cheaper version as a failsafe if you need it. Despite never returning to Standard, Overload has been used in no fewer than 5 supplemental sets, all of which have contained exciting and clever new Overload designs. But even with all this revisiting of the mechanic in supplemental products, we haven't seen it in Standard since Dragon's Maze. Despite being an Is It mechanic in its original iteration, there is no inherent reason why the mechanic needs to be limited to those colors forever. That means we've barely scratched the surface of what the mechanic can do. And even Wizards of the Coast seems keen to play around with that design space, as Overload has left Is It colors 7 times, including card designs in white, green, and damn, black cards. I mean, just look at that masterpiece. Damn! It's a textbook example of how you tell a story with card design. So how many of these awesome keywords have surprised you that they've never returned to Standard and that they're over 10 years old? Well, what do you think are the top 2 that this list will hold? Coming in at number 2, it's an awesome keyword that has been missing in action for quite some time. Coming in at number 2, we have Evoke. The Evoke mechanic is at the forefront of many Magic the Gathering players' minds thanks to the devastatingly powerful Mythic cycle from Modern Horizons 2, a cycle which made a big impact in virtually every format where the cards are legal. But despite Evoke's major role in Modern Horizons 2, it has not graced Standard since Morningtide in 2008. 2008! It's been 15 years since Evoke was a legal Standard mechanic. You know, the key mechanic for beloved cards like Muldrifter, Revelark, and Shriekmaw, the card design that turns creatures into spells, the keyword that is the textbook definition of evocative. Evoke is one of the most inspired mechanics Wizards of the Coast has ever designed. It's a keyword that's printed on creatures that allows you to cast them for an alternate, usually cheaper, though not always, casting cost. But if you do, it sacrifices itself when it enters the battlefield. Essentially, an evoked creature is equivalent to a sorcery, or an instant if the creature has flash. Evoked Muldrifter and Shriekmaw, for example, are basically divination and terror, two classic iconic spells in their own right, made even stronger by the option to strap them to a creature for an additional mana investment. However, there's a difference between an evoked creature and an instant or sorcery that does the same thing, namely if you pair them with a flicker or undying effect. Say you cast Muldrifter for 3 mana, then hold priority with its enter the battlefield self-sacrifice clause on the stack. If you then cast Flicker of Fate, the Muldrifter will be exiled, then immediately return to the battlefield to draw you 2 more cards. When the evoke trigger resolves, the original Muldrifter will be nowhere to be found, since the new Muldrifter is considered a new game object. You'll get to keep your Muldrifter and draw an additional 2 cards, all for the same amount of mana as you'd have spent to hardcast the Muldrifter in the first place. By all accounts, the evoke mechanic is fantastic. It's powerful for the same reason Overload is powerful, giving you a modal card that scales depending on whether you cast it early for less mana or later for more mana. Its interaction with flicker effects like Ephemerate or undying effects like Feign Death make for exciting synergistic gameplay. Since the release of Modern Horizons 2, the evoke mechanic has become a cornerstone of modern gameplay. The 5 evoke elementals are all excellent cards, doubling as free spells akin to Force of Will or powerful creatures with devastating enter the battlefield effects when cast for full retail. These elementals form the backbone of several distinct archetypes, including Rakdos Scam, a mid-range deck built around putting a Grief or Fury into play on turn 1 and casting a Feign Death on it, and 4-color Omnath, which takes advantage of Omnath's ability to pitch to several of the elementals and gives you the mana needed to hardcast them with just a single fetch land. Evoke is also who I have to thank for George absolutely ruining my day in Legacy, where I was literally about to turn to a Grizzlebrand, but then somehow had the rug pulled out from under me. But either way, Evoke is such a beloved mechanic that it is virtually guaranteed to come back to Standard one day, perhaps with the return to Lorwyn that was announced at the Gen Con Magic 30 celebration. It's just a shame that it's taken them more than 15 years to do it. So what is the number 1 keyword on our list? Well, the absolute best mechanic that's never returned to Standard is another from the plane of Lorwyn, or rather, Lorwyn's evil twin, Shadowmoor. Yes, I'm referring to Persist. Persist is an ability on creatures that returns them to play when they die with a -1/-1 counter on them, provided they didn't already have a -1/-1 counter on them when they died. The Persist mechanic is an excellent value mechanic, giving you an additional use out of your creature for the well-balanced cost of that creature being smaller the second time around. Cards like Kitchen Finks and Glen Elendra Archmage were staples in constructed formats as well as Cube for a long time. The mechanic also lent itself to combos, with cards like Murderous Redcap and Kitchen Finks going infinite with a sacrifice outlet and a way to give your creatures +1/+1 counters when they entered play, or to prevent them from gaining -1/-1 counters with something like Melira's Sylvok Outcast. Big creatures with Persist insulate you from cheap removal blowing out your significant mana investment, which meant Woodfall Primus and Twilight Shepherd served as excellent top-end cards. Woodfall Primus even recently enjoyed a resurgence in the Magic Online Vintage Cube thanks to its devastating synergy with Flash. Cast Flash at the end of your opponent's second turn, putting Primus into play to blow up a land. Primus dies immediately but returns to the battlefield as a 5/5 that blows up another of your opponent's lands. What puts Persist over the top among its peers is the alluring combo potential potential that the keyword offers. For the most part, persist combos tend to involve 3 cards at a minimum: the persist creature, a sacrifice outlet, and a way to remove the -1/-1 counter from the persist creature. A plus B plus C combos like this are among the most fun combos that Magic has to offer, as they give you a dream to work toward, but are not as easily assembled as something like the Pestermite Splinter Twin combo. They're achievable, but only through some amount of effort, which makes the reward feel all the sweeter when you're able to pull it off. There were several such examples of these 3-card combos when Wizards of the Coast revisited Persist briefly in Modern Horizons 1. These combos were actually draftable and limited, but didn't even require any rares to pull off. Pair either Putrid Goblin or Lesser Masticore with Good Fortune Unicorn, and one of several sack outlets in the set to sacrifice your persistent creatures infinite times. These 3-card combos in Modern Horizons 1 Limited do a great job of showcasing just how fun the persist mechanic can be. But unfortunately, apart from these 2 creatures in Modern Horizons 1, there hasn't been a single persist creature printed since 2008. I sincerely hope we see a return to this extraordinarily fun mechanic soon, and since it has been confirmed that we are indeed returning to Lorwyn, I expect I may just get my wish. The fact that the keyword was iconic enough to receive its own card in Modern Horizons 2 should be more than enough evidence that the mechanic is worth revisiting in Standard. The design space for the mechanic is fairly large, and it's not restricted by color and can go on creatures that do a myriad of different things. I sincerely hope we return to this extraordinarily fun mechanic soon. But that's just my list, and now I want to hear from you. Is there an awesome mechanic that has not returned to Standard except in supplemental products, but really should? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love hearing me talk about the best and worst of card design, check out my other videos in this series where we explore what Magic the Gathering does right and what maybe it made a few mistakes on, but we'll allow it. It's been 30 years. Hey, and remember, if you're looking for an RPG adventure you can carry in your pocket, download Dungeon Hunter 6 on iOS Android today. Dungeon Hunter 6 is a mobile action RPG that features fast-paced hack-and-slash combat with a suite of classes and skills to utilize as you take on powerful bosses. What's great about this game is you can choose between PvE and PvP, all while you battle in real-time guild wars, grind skill trees, trade items, and more. Best of all, it's absolutely free to play. Just download it now using the link in this video's description or scan this QR code on the screen. When you do, you get a special starter pack and can use your game account to enter the launch Lucky Spin event with free-to-win great prizes like an iPhone 15 Pro Max, a PS5, an Apple Watch, and more, all of which starts October 15th. Thanks again for sponsoring this video.
Next time on Shuffle Up and Play, Kisses and Hugs.
Today, Aaron Hansen picks the format. What did you choose for us today, Aaron?
Under $50? This is Agnes the Dragon's Lash.
Hi, I'm Spencer Crittenden, Akeem the Soaring Wind.
My commander is Volrath the Fallen.
Hi there, I am Talia Vest, Yargle, and Multani.
Ah!
What?
Yargle! What do you live in a glen?
No, well, maybe.
Kind of.
This is a hard decision.
I don't think it is. Just hit me.
Yeah, you're right. It's not a hard decision.
What?
You haven't seen the station agent?
He has a hat.
Oh, he doesn't have a hat.
Does anyone want to cut me?
Absolutely.
Not that way. But after the show, we can talk.